Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to today's Friday Reflections with myself, Paul Salahuddin Armstrong, on this, the 16th of February 2024. I hope you are well, wherever you're tuning into this from, and that you're having a good day. And for those who are not, then you, in my thoughts and in my prayers, and may Allah make things easier for you. Before I want to go any further, I would like to also wish Yahya a very happy and blessed birthday. It's his birthday today, so Alhamdulillah, may Allah grant him good health and long life and many more birthdays. I mean, uh, today I would like to read to you from this wonderful book, The Leadership of Muhammad, by Professor Joel Hayward. And I'm going to read from page 99 of the book, Maximizing Human Potential. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The Prophet Muhammad believed not only in inspiring and motivating people, both in the peace he liked and the warfare he disliked, but also through the thoughtful delegation of responsibilities. Through delegation, he knew he could develop the confidence and capacity of people who seemed to possess potential for growth, so that they might themselves move into leadership roles. He understood that delegation gave people senses of empowerment and motivation, and that those would increase productivity and effectiveness, because those who had been entrusted with tasks would work even harder than usual to prove the trust in them had not been misplaced. I mean, this maximizing human potential, this is something which is a very relevant topic that many people today would regard outside of religion, outside of anything, to do with business, to do with education, to do with personal development. And yet this is something which the Prophet Muhammad cared a lot about, and it runs right the way through his leadership and how he led people, and led by example, and led by entrusting the right people with responsibilities. He saw delegation having four sequential phases: selecting, training, trusting, and rewarding. In other words, he constantly watched his people, especially the young and committed, looking for the potential in a person that he could build upon. So the Prophet Muhammad was always looking at the Sahaba, always looking at the companions, and to see who could be encouraged, who had potential that wasn't developed, that could be built upon. Subhanallah. I mean, this is very good practice and a good example, subhanAllah. When he saw someone with that extra spark, he brought that person close to him or to another elder, so that through example, as well as direct engagement, he might help to train that person. Then when he felt that person was ready to embrace responsibility, he would delegate a task to them. Sometimes, if he considered him ready, the task would be surprisingly large, complex, and important. So sometimes the Prophet Muhammad would even entrust them with something that was a more difficult task, which is interesting, because normally in leadership, you tend to entrust someone with a smaller task, something that's easier to accomplish, and then something harder if they are successful at accomplishing that task. But of course, these would have been cases the Prophet Muhammad was sure of what he was doing. It is worth analyzing each of these steps in greater detail, beginning with how Muhammad spotted talent within his people. As noted above, he liked to get to know his people, watching them in the mosque, in their homes, and in social interactions. Sometimes they visited as house guests or as students. Some of his companions visited him on alternate days and met to share what each had learned so that they would not miss out on his teachings. Malik ibn al-Hawayth recalled, "We came to the Prophet ﷺ and stayed with him for 20 days and nights. We were all young and of about the same age. The Prophet ﷺ was very kind and merciful. Rather like Plato with his academy and Aristotle with his Lyceum, Muhammad created an informal, peripatetic style of infrastructure, which involved not only intense sessions inside a home in Mecca, known as the House of Al-Akham, but also extensive training, talking, discussing, and debating each day while walking with his students and companions. But also extensive talking, discussing, debating each day while walking with his companions and students. How does this sound today? Very similar to some good examples of sheikhs. I have seen this in practice. He not only taught them, but also watched them carefully, studying their interests, strengths, and weaknesses. He looked to see their piety, creativity, and intelligence. And later, when warfare occurred, he watched to see who possessed energy, courage, and resolve. During the Battle of the Trench, he urgently needed information about the enemy's movements. He called for a volunteer to undertake a stealthy and dangerous reconnaissance behind enemy lines. One man, Zubair ibn al-Awam, volunteered. To stress the danger of the task, the Prophet asked again for a volunteer. Zubair stepped forward again. A third time he asked, and once again Zubair volunteered. Delighted, the Prophet praised him publicly. Every prophet has a disciple, and my disciple is Zubair. So you see, by asking a number of times, he could see who had the resolve to keep coming forward. Or would Zubair accept? Would he ask again? Or would he back off because the Prophet didn't pick him the first time he volunteered? And this is actually good advice in life, because if you are in a situation and you don't succeed the first time, wa alaikum salam. If you're in a situation where you're going for an opportunity and you don't succeed the first time, as my dad always used to say to me, try, and try again until you succeed. And this is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ was testing Zubair on. Would he try again? Because this was a very difficult task. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ needed someone with firm resolve and determination. So the Prophet ﷺ tested that determination by asking for volunteers, 3 times? 3 times, to see if Zubair each time would put himself forward. This shows he was determined and he had the resolve to do it, which is what you need with a difficult task. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was always happy with those who worked hard to support his plans when they knew it involved discomfort or struggle. These were people to cultivate. Straight after the Battle of Uhud, which was Muhammad's first defeat, he called for volunteers to ride after the withdrawing opponents in a show of strength. Who will go after them? He called out. This prompted a swell of enthusiasm, but he chose from among the volunteers only those who had fought the day before, not wanting any shirkers or cowards to pretend they were riding out bravely when in fact the enemy was already leaving. Among those chosen by Muhammad were 2 brothers who had been badly wounded the day before. With only one mount between them, they were so keen to show him their worth that they took turns riding and walking. He was naturally delighted to have warriors with such tenacity and fortitude. Muhammad ﷺ constantly looked to see among his people who had initiative, and sometimes asked, "Who will hear these words of mine and then actually act upon them, or even teach them to someone who might act upon them?" On the other hand, he did not like people to take on roles or tasks beyond their abilities. And he did not respect people who sought status and power for their own sake, rather than from a desire to serve. So a few important points here. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ constantly looked at people to see who had initiative, who would actually try, who would actually put themselves forward to do things. It's very important, because if you don't have initiative, you have no leadership. Initiative is one of the first parts of leadership. You have to actually have the to actually go up there and do something. If you don't have that, then you cannot lead. You cannot lead anybody. You can't even lead yourself. And this here, who will hear these words of mine and actually act upon them? How many people talk? Many people talk. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said this, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that. Islam teaches this, Islam teaches that. Yet how many are people acting upon that? Or if there is a problem within our community, they will point it out. That bridge is broken. That bridge is broken. That bridge is broken. But who's going to actually report it to the authorities? That bridge is broken. It needs to get fixed. Or if we're in a responsibility position within our community, actually organize the fixing of that bridge. It's very easy to talk. It's quite another thing to act upon it. People who act upon it are doers. They're not just people who are speakers. It's very easy to talk. Quite another thing to do. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was always keen to see who was just listening, if they're even listening. Some people don't even listen. But then who would actually act upon it? Whether they would act upon it by actually doing something, or whether they would act upon it by at least teaching someone. On the other hand, the Prophet didn't like people who took on roles or tasks that were too much for them. So there's a balance here between people who have got the initiative and are doing things, but at the same time, Prophet Muhammad didn't like people to take on more than what they were capable of. There's a balance here, and everybody has different abilities. Everybody has different capabilities. So people shouldn't take on more than, we say it in English, you bit off more than you can chew. We have to be careful with that, because it can be harmful if a person takes on more than what they're able to actually implement. And also people who are looking for roles. Prophet didn't respect people who just sought power or status for its own ends. So people who just wanted to be a lord or a imam or whatever kind of status, just for the sake of doing that. But it had to come from a place of they wanted to serve. You serve to lead. Real leadership is from serving other people. Real leadership is not from saying, I'm the boss, and just telling other people what to do. It's leading through example. It's through serving your community, serving other people, doing what needs to be done, being there to support when that is necessary. In a much quoted and sometimes misquoted hadith, Muhammad told Abdul Rahman Ibn Samura, do not seek leadership, because if you are given authority, then you will be held accountable for it. But if you are given it without asking for it, then you will be helped by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So do not seek leadership, because if you're given authority, Allah will hold you questionable for that. You sought it, so you have to dispense it responsibly. If, however, you are granted leadership and you didn't want it, then Allah will support you. Muhammad was not trying to diminish the marvelous spirit of volunteerism that has always proved so beneficial within groups or organizations. He admired the genuine desire to serve that he often saw. He was really trying to say, as Aesop had once said, be careful what you wish for. Leadership came with a heavy burden of responsibility, especially to be scrupulously just. And as noted at the beginning of this analysis, every shepherd will be asked about his treatment of his master's possessions, meaning both in this world and on Judgment Day. So you see, be careful what we wish for, yeah? It's, yes, because we will get what we wish for in one way or another. But then that comes with a lot of responsibility. What are we then going to do once we get what we wish for? Well, that's another question. If we dispense it responsibly, then it becomes a blessing. But if we mess up, once we get what we wish for, then we lose everything. So it's, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, understood that people learn best by doing. He often said that when 3 or more people go on a journey, they should select a leader among them. This seems an odd and excessive expectation, which some commentators explain away by saying that the Prophet, peace be upon him, meant a prayer leader. That is, they should decide who amongst them was most expert in Quran and good conduct. Muslims should indeed assign a prayer leader, but this is a limited reading of what Muhammad actually meant. More logically, he understood that any travel would require at least some administration and logistics, and that to learn essential skills that could later be built upon. Responsibility for these matters should be apportioned to someone with apparent aptitude. So you see, logically, you cannot undertake a journey or any undertaking without having certain things you need to consider. Your plans for the journey, where you're going to eat, where you're going to sleep, what form of transport are you going to use? How are you going to pay for all of that? What is your budget? All of these things have to be considered. And many other things besides. You also have to consider, well, what are normal expectations and what other things could happen while you're on a journey. Unexpected things might happen. So you need to have someone who is able to deal with these situations, to manage that. Whether you call them a manager or a group leader or an emir, or but this is more than someone just reading the prayers. When caravan raids commenced shortly after the emigration to Medina, Muhammad himself commanded some of these missions. Each time he went, he left a different person in charge of the believers in Medina. thus sharing out the responsibility for people to embrace responsibility, learn new skills, or deepen their religiosity through service to the community. In short succession, to illustrate the point, he left Sa'd ibn Ubaidah, Abu Salama ibn Abdul Salam, sorry, Abu Salama ibn Abd al-Asad, and Abdullah ibn Ubay in charge. So each time the Prophet left someone else in charge when he was away. Again, it's giving each of those people an opportunity to develop their leadership skills and to show responsibility and also to serve their community. If this wasn't the case, if he didn't leave different people in charge and he gave, let's say, the task only to one person, then only that person would develop. He was very keen to delegate to people, even of a young age, seeing them as guileless, zealous, energetic, loyal, and unswerving. For example, in 616 CE, when this Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sent a second group of around 80 Muslims to Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia, to seek asylum from King Amar during a period of persecution in Mecca, he placed them under the authority of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. This young man, aged either 25 or 26, was far younger than most of the emigrants, but he had served a thorough informal apprenticeship by learning directly from Muhammad and Abu Bakr and other elders. Ja'far was an inspired choice. When the Abyssinian king debated expelling the refugees, Ja'far spoke so eloquently and compellingly about the similarities between Muhammad's teachings and those of Christianity that the king agreed to provide them with asylum. A year before, Muhammad left Mecca for Medina in 622 CE. 12 Medinans met him in Aqaba outside Mecca and pledged loyalty to him and obedience to his moral code. When they planned to return home, they requested he send a representative to Medina in order to teach the Quran and invite people to Islam. Muhammad, then over 50, could have sent one of his trusted comrades in his own age group. Instead, he appointed Musab ibn Umair, recently returned from Abyssinia and then aged no more than 28, as Islam's first ambassador. To Muhammad's distress, he died in the Battle of Uhud 3 years later. After the opening of Mecca in 630 CE, Muhammad moved to defend his polity against forces massing against him. In his absence, he needed to appoint a competent and trustworthy leader in Mecca, which had not yet become used to Islam. Despite having countless seasoned Muslims from whom to select, including his closest companions, Abu Bakr, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman ibn Affan, and his son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad chose a 21-year-old young man named Attab ibn Asid and asked him to pray with the people and act as a steward. He was, in fact, the first prayer leader after Muhammad himself to hold communal prayers in Mecca after its conquest. He was a fine administrator and a leader, and he remained in post in Mecca until well after Muhammad's death. 21 years old. Very young to be given such a responsibility. But the Prophet Muhammad obviously saw his capability, saw his potential, and gave him the opportunity. Similarly, when the people of Banu Thaqif of Taif converted to Islam in 630 CE, Muhammad appointed Uthman ibn Abu al-As as their new leader, despite his youth, because of his reputation for piety. He saw something special in him and was proven right. After justly governing Taif, Uthman ibn Abu al-As served as Muhammad's successors as governor of Bahrain, Eastern Arabia, and Oman, Southeastern Arabia. Muhammad was very fond of Osama ibn Zayd, the son of his adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha, and for many years used to have Osama ride behind him on his donkey. He thus received every personal tuition. Muhammad even let Osama enter the Kaaba with him, which was a rare privilege. When he was 15, Osama uttered the Islamic confession of faith. He was corrected by both Bashir ibn Sa'd, his patrol captain, and by the Prophet. Nonetheless, when Osama was 19, Muhammad advised him that he wanted to send him north as the military leader of a major expedition to avenge his father Zayd's death. This offended many of the older warriors and caused Muhammad publicly to put his foot down. Osama was ready, and indeed he was suited for the mission. There was no nepotism or cronyism in Muhammad's decision. He simply believed that, although young, Osama was the right man for the job. Muhammad was, in fact, deeply opposed to delegating authority or responsibility, both large and small, to people who were unqualified or unworthy. Trusting people with oversight of issues when they were unqualified, he said, would be one of the signs of the last day. Yeah, indeed, I'm familiar with that hadith. The Prophet warned us that one of the signs of the last days would be that people who are incompetent and unqualified would be given responsibilities. Subhanallah. Abu Dar al-Ghifari, a very early convert and dear companion of the Prophet, once approached him with a request for an appointment to a public office. He hoped his friendship would secure the role, but Muhammad gently stroked his shoulder and explained that because of its perceived weakness and responsibility required trust, he could not oblige. He added that on the day of judgment, the apportionment of responsibilities would be a source of repentance and humiliation unless it involved a proper fulfillment of obligations. Likewise, when another man came to the Prophet and said, "You appointed so and so, but you haven't appointed me to anything," Muhammad very gently and supportively told him that, in effect, he should accept what might for now seem like injustice, and that even leaders after him would pass the man over in favor of others, but that he should look for Muhammad on the day of judgment, when he might finally get his reward. We do not know what weakness Muhammad had seen in him. The appointment of a person to lead a detachment of troops was perhaps the most common form of delegation within Muhammad's community. The raids were ordinarily not as one might imagine them, battles designed to kill and defeat enemies for political purposes. Rather, some were either small-scale surprise attacks on undefended or lightly defended caravans for material gain, at a time when the Islamic polity was struggling financially, and then equally small raids on Bedouins for livestock. Most were shows of force, designed to gain control over certain roads or regions, to discourage groups from allying themselves with the Quraysh, to establish allies, or to convert the clans and the Bedouins. So you see, although these were battles, they were conflicts in a sense, they were not the way that we often perceive them today, because we have a very modern perception of war, which is incredibly destructive, and it's very tragic for human life. But in those days, the casualties were very few. Professor Joel Hayward told me, I think it was about 80 people died throughout all of the conflicts, all of the battles that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, either led or orchestrated, during that period of time that he was in the leadership. I mean, 80 people over all of those conflicts is not a lot of people. When you think today, how many people die even in one battle? Because war has changed, weaponry has changed, the nature of conflict has changed. Professor Joel told me that in many of these battles, it was simply like one group of people trying to get the camels or the livestock of the other group, and all the tribes were doing this. And they would either be successful or not, and sometimes it would just involve chasing people away. And in those sorts of battles, it was called a battle, but in reality, nobody died. Maybe some property would change hands, but nobody actually died in most of those battles. Or where it happened, it was just an individual here or there. Oh, obviously, any loss of human life is always something that's not good. But at the same time, we're not talking about large numbers of casualties. We're talking about a different kind of conflict. And this was part and parcel of 7th century Arabia, whether Muhammad was teaching Islam or not. And actually, Islam reduced the likelihood that people would be mistreated if they were taken into custody by the Muslims, and certain other aspects which were different from what came before it. A long-established part of Arab culture, such raids were hardly military in nature, and most involved small numbers of warriors, little fighting, and few or no deaths. The sources tell us that a particularly fierce battle during Qutbah ibn Amir ibn Hadida's raid, ordered by Muhammad on a community from Khatam in the Tabala region. Yet there were only 20 warriors in total, mounted on 10 camels. So we need to keep in mind the small scale of such battles. Although small and light in casualties, they gave the Islamic polity invaluable experience, and when successful, increased prestige and authority. No wonder Muhammad Salam saw them as an ideal apprenticeship for his young men. Sometimes Muhammad selected these leaders purely because he saw potential that he wanted to develop. And other times he chose them because of their intimate local knowledge. For example, he chose Ibn Abi al-Ajar al-Sulami to raid the Banu Sulaim, to which he had belonged, and Ghalib ibn Abdullah al-Laythi to fight the Banu al-Mulawat of the Banu Layth, from which he had come. The Prophet, peace be upon him, sent Amir ibn al-As, although only a new convert, to lead a detachment against the Bali and Qudus, because the Bali were maternal relatives, and Muhammad hoped that Amir might be able to recruit from among them. Interestingly, Amir refused to let his warriors light a fire to keep back the cold, presumably because the fire would reveal their whereabouts. Some of the long-serving warriors argued back at him, doubtless bothered that a newcomer to Islam had received the Prophet's authority. But Amir had and knew it. You were ordered to listen to me and obey me, he said. Do it. Muhammad embraced his responsibility to try to remedy flaws. Muhammad embraced his responsibility to try to remedy flaws that he perceived within subordinates, recognizing, of course, that change ultimately had to come from within. After the conversion of Khalid ibn al-Walid, the talented, fierce, and fearless warrior, whose cavalry charge into Muhammad's rear had caused his defeat at the Battle of Uhud, the Prophet was naturally pleased to have Khalid fighting on his side and not against him. Yet he clearly saw that Khalid was, as he said of another fierce companion, Kirash ibn Umayyah, too prone to kill. He understood that Khalid was a gifted and courageous fighter, which he could use if controlled, but his aggression and innate tendency towards violence would need to be tempered outside of battle. This initially proved a difficult task. After Khalid distinguished himself in the Battle of Mu'tah in 629 CE, Muhammad was upset when Khalid, like the aforementioned Kirash ibn Umayyah, killed people during the liberation of Mecca in 630, a campaign that was supposed to be entirely bloodless. For some time after, Muhammad therefore sent Khalid out on other missions, not to fight, but to call tribes to Islam. This Muhammad hoped would teach him composure and patience. He nonetheless worried that Khalid might exceed bounds, and indeed on one occasion he did, when Muhammad sent him to the Banu Jadima of Kinana. When Banu Jadima saw that Khalid was in their midst, they panicked and reached for their weapons. Khalid told them to lay down their weapons, that he would do them no harm. They quickly complied and surrendered their weapons, informing Khalid that they were, in fact, converts. Rejecting or misunderstanding this claim, they spoke a different dialect. Khalid bound them and had some executed. A number of Muhajirun and Ansar warriors in Khalid's force, who knew Muhammad's teachings on justice, directly disobeyed Khalid and refused to kill anyone, much to his annoyance. They knew that obedience was ordinarily essential. It was, in fact, an Islamic teaching, but as shown above, an act contrary to God's book or the Prophet ﷺ had to be disobeyed. When Muhammad learned of Khalid's atrocity, he raised his hands to God and exclaimed, "O Allah, I'm innocent before you of what Khalid has done." He then took out a loan and sent Ali ibn Abi Talib with the money to make restitution with the Banu Jadima, paying them blood money and compensation for everything damaged, right down to a dog's bowl. The outrage was so serious that Ali actually compensated them excessively, something Muhammad later commended. When Khalid presented himself to Muhammad, the Prophet turned away from Khalid and was angry with him, shunning him for a while to teach him the significance of his error. After two Muslim elders tried to reason with Khalid, causing him to remonstrate, Muhammad then rebuked him openly, telling him to be quiet and not to criticize his companions, whose merits were worth twice any mountain of gold, literally Mount Uhud, that Khalid could spend in God's service. The heated displeasure of the Prophet was a serious rebuke and made Khalid change his ways. Muhammad nonetheless knew that Khalid was an asset and that if he could be controlled, he would become a great Muslim champion. He patiently persisted, working closely with Khalid to guide him before sending him out on further missions. Khalid still made mistakes, though never one as egregious as with the Banu Jadima. During the Hunayn campaign, Muhammad came across a cluster of people gathered around the body of a slain woman. The Prophet sent someone to ask what had happened. When he returned and reported the woman slain, the Prophet exclaimed that women must never be killed. When he learned Khalid was in charge of the responsible unit, Muhammad sent a messenger to instruct Khalid to never kill women. This error notwithstanding, Khalid proved invaluable to the remaining years of Muhammad's life, and later conquered Asham, the Greater Syria, in what most military historians consider a strategic triumph. When Muhammad did empower subordinates to undertake certain tasks or responsibilities, he tried hard not to tie their hands, but more flexibly, to leave them with room for initiative and judgment. Initiative and judgment is something very important in leadership. Some leaders, they squash this in the people under them, and then they never become great leaders, or they get fed up and they leave and do something else. So a business or an organization loses good people because of that. Granting subordinates the freedom to use their initiative does not mean that everyone did so. Some were less willing than others. When Umar led a raid against some of the Hawazin in 628, the opponents dispersed before his group arrived. The Bedouin guide, suggested that Umar instead make a raid on another nearby Bedouin group, which Umar declined to do because Muhammad had not explicitly authorized it. On another occasion, the detachment leader, Abu Salama, faced exactly the same situation Umar had, but when he realized that his enemy had dispersed, he sent two-thirds of his force to raid other groups and take spoils. The Prophet was happy with both decisions. Al-Waqidi chronicles Muhammad's dispatch of Bashir ibn Asad and 300 warriors to Al-Jinab. When they arrived in the vicinity, they came across a herd of cattle and discussed amongst themselves whether to appropriate the herd, which would mean they could not thereafter move with speed or surprise, whether to continue against the enemy as they'd been tasked. Using their initiative, they took the cattle, along with two prisoners who converted and were later freed by Muhammad. It was a successful mission. Perhaps the best expression of initiative imparted to those given tasks is the case of Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen, when Muhammad sent him to serve as a governor and to collect zakat. He asked him how he would settle any disputes. Mu'adh replied that he would rely on Quranic revelation. When Muhammad asked him what he would do if he could not find the answer he needed, Mu'adh said he would rely on Muhammad's own example and try to do what he knew the Prophet would do. When Muhammad probed further, asking what Mu'adh would do if he could not find a useful example, i.e., either within the Quran or within the Prophet's Sunnah, he said he would strive to apply his own judgment to the issue. Muhammad was delighted with the answer and fondly patted him on the chest. Well, that's an interesting one, because today you get some people, they say that you can only follow the Quran and the Sunnah. And yet Muhammad asked Mu'adh specifically what he would do if, and he said, Mu'adh said, I would look in the Quran. And if he couldn't find the answer in the Quran, he said, well, I would look at how you dealt with things, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the Prophet asked him, what if you couldn't find it within either of those? And Mu'adh said then he would use his own judgment. And the Prophet was delighted with that. So you see, there's a lot of misunderstandings in Islam. Muhammad was delighted with the answer and fondly patted him on the chest. Here we see an early expression of what Islamic scholars would later call ijtihad, the independent mental struggle to find sound answers to questions apparently left unanswered by the Quran, the teachings and practices of Muhammad, and the consensus of the scholars, or ijma. Indeed, Mu'adh had used a form of the very word ijtihad when he explained his proposed method to Muhammad. He said, Ana ajtidu, Ana tahidu. That is, that he would exert himself to find the correct reasoning. Here we also see a type of empowerment that today we call mission command or directive control, which means trusting one's trained and trusted subordinates to use their initiative to deliver the outcome they know the superior would want. This type of leadership promotes initiative and quick decision making within reasonable and clearly communicated and mutually understood constraints. The leader informs the subordinate of his intentions, as well as the subordinate's own task and its context. Ideally, he says what is needed and why it is needed. Once away from the boss, the subordinate can then decide within his delegated freedom how best to achieve the task, keeping in mind what he knows or believes the boss would do if he was there. The principle might be unusual in some cultures, but in Islam, this was and still is entirely natural. Aside from the Quran itself, the Prophet's Sunnah guided all conduct, actions, and habits. Everyone in Muhammad's community tried to emulate the way he did both major and mundane things, not only because they wanted to garner his happiness, but also because they saw him as an ideal, seldom erring person. Some Christians today use the slogan WWJD, meaning what would Jesus do, to denote the moral imperative to act in a manner consistent with their Messiah. For 1,400 years, all Muslims have done this, with Muhammad's example being their object of focus as a core aspect of their religious understanding. The Sunnah found written expression a few centuries after his death in the vast corpus of ahadith, a normative body of laws and guidance that draw upon them. Also importantly, when dispatching Mu'adh ibn Jabal to govern Yemen, Muhammad gave him guiding advice on how a good leader should always act. Clearly, with shepherding and gentle care in mind, rather than the exploitation or coercion which would inevitably cause antagonism. Muhammad said, make things easy and not difficult for the people, and give them good tidings, and do not turn them against you. Such a beautiful piece of advice. Make things easy and not difficult for the people, and give good tidings, and do not turn them against you. It's a fundamental advice of the Prophet Muhammad in how we engage with people. Those people can be any religion, any background, any community. Muhammad believed in rewarding excellence or special effort and gave distinguished contributors gifts of weapons, clothing, horses, and camels, and even administrative functions such as zakat gatherer or leadership roles. A few examples will amply demonstrate this desire to reward. As they marched to meet the Quraysh at Uhud in 625 CE, Muhammad rewarded Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundhir, the companion who had a year earlier been in the Battle of Badr, and advised him cleverly where to position his troops. Now he rewarded Al-Hubab with the honor of carrying the Khazraj banner into battle. In 627 CE, Abdullah ibn Umar fought alongside Muhammad in the Battle of the Trench when he was only 15, having been denied permission to fight at Badr 2 years earlier. For his courage and for ongoing service during the raid on Banu Qurayza, Muhammad rewarded Abdullah in 629 with appointing him as a Qura or communal Quran reciter. During the Battle of Khyber, he hoped to find someone sufficiently meritorious to serve as a standard bearer. In an Arab army, this was a great honor and was ordinarily assigned to a proven leader. Ali ibn Abi Talib had initially been unable to fight because of an eye ailment, something wrong with his eye. But he felt ashamed not to join Muhammad, so he took his place in the battle despite his eye problems. Muhammad was moved and impressed and duly bestowed upon Ali the honor of carrying the flag. After Khalid bin al-Walid's heroism and selflessness in the Battle of Mu'tah, when he held aloft the Muslim flag and rallied troops to it under his own initiative after 3 other flag bearers had been killed, Muhammad bestowed upon him a reward so great that it has survived for 1,400 years. His title as the Sword of Allah. When new Meccan converts fought in the Battle of Hunain, and thus proved their loyalty at a time when some of Muhammad's advisors expressed concern about their sincerity, he rewarded them with unusually large numbers of camels. When Abdullah ibn Anis returned from a mission to kill Khalid ibn Sufyan in Nubayr al-Hudhali, a bitter and intransigent foe who was raising a force against Muhammad, the Prophet rewarded him with the gift of a staff, telling him it would be a sign between you and me on Resurrection Day. Abdullah ibn Anis was so moved by the gift that he kept it close throughout his life and had it enclosed in his shroud when he was buried. Muhammad was both people and task focused, and sometimes became disappointed when a task was left incomplete, especially if he believed it was manageable by the team he assigned, even if not by the leader himself. He wanted to see initiative. After one military patrol failed, he said with frustration, "When I send out a man who does not fulfill my commands, are you unable to appoint in his place one who would fulfill my commands?" In other words, if there's a group of you and you're working on some initiative or some task, and it turns out that the person who's been appointed with the responsibility to fulfill that thing, to implement it, and they can't do it, then you find someone else who can. It's a basic principle, but it's not always followed. And when you follow it, you're more likely to achieve what you're trying to achieve. But if you don't follow it, then what's going to happen? Nothing's going to happen. The Prophet did not like having to chase people to do something he had asked them. If he asked for something to be done, he only liked to ask once. He also wanted it done right, completed to the degree he had asked. When he asked Khalid ibn al-Walid to destroy the shrine to the pagan goddess Al-Uzza, the latter returned and confirmed that he had done as requested. Muhammad inquired what he had done, but was unhappy with the answer. "Surely you have not destroyed it, so go back and do it right this time." Yet he was very tolerant of mistakes and is not known to have rebuked anyone for a lack of success, even in the military sphere, if they had shown genuine effort. As he said, "When I ask you to do something, do it as best, literally as much as you can." If results were imperfect, but the effort was genuine, he never criticized. He believed that it was better for a leader to make a mistake in forgiving than to make it in punishing. Now, if only more leaders had that, to believe that it was better to make a mistake in forgiving people rather than punishing them. Today, a lot of leaders are more likely to make a mistake in punishing rather than in forgiving. And even the people at large, the electorate, in democratic countries. He also taught that Muslims should not publicly disclose each other's faults, but to protect the dignity of those who had erred or failed, should always cover them, that is, keep them unspoken. He said, whoever covers the faults of a brother, Allah will cover his on the day of judgment. Now, what this means is, if you notice a fault in someone, you shouldn't keep going on about it and criticizing them openly. However, if you have a friend or someone who's going to go into business, and it comes to your attention that they might be going to do business with someone who's a cheat or a fraudster, you can quietly mention it to them. But you don't openly attack that person and mock them, or as some people do today, just gossiping for no reason. The Prophet strictly practiced what he preached. Anas ibn Malik, a young man who was for Muhammad what we would today call a personal assistant, recalled, I served the Prophet for 10 years. He never said oof, an expression of disgust, and never blamed me by saying, why did you do so? Or why did you not do so? When his army returned from a defeat in Mu'tah, many of the Medinans crowded the streets and mocked and jeered at them for falling. Some even threw dirt at them. Muhammad, on the other hand, was quick to stop this maltreatment, telling the people, they have not fled the battlefield, they will return if God wills it. He was also remarkably forgiving when disobeyed, which certainly did not happen often, but cases can be found in the earliest sources. This is not surprising given that even Moses' people had disobeyed him. Many humans are weak, foolish, and disobedient by nature, and even a prophet in their midst was not always enough to transform them. Al-Waqidi records that when Muhammad signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, his followers were initially unable to grasp the strategic significance and saw it as a humiliation. Resentful and angry, they refused his order to shave their heads and slaughter the sacrificial animals. He was deeply upset. But he could not get them to comply with his instructions until, as an example to them, on his wife, Saliman's sorry. So the Prophet was deeply upset, but he could not get them to comply with his instructions until, as an example to them, on his wife Salama's advice, he had his own head shaved and his animals slaughtered. Ashamed, they finally did as they were told, conveying a revelation that the treaty was, in fact, a great victory. He forgave them totally, with no residual bad feelings. Similarly, before the advice on Mecca in 630 CE, the Prophet demanded total secrecy. As noted above, one man, Hatib ibn Abu Balta, nonetheless dispatched an informer to Mecca to warn them of Muhammad's plans. The informer was intercepted, and Muhammad summoned Hatib. He begged for forgiveness, explaining that he had disobeyed the Prophet out of fear for his son and family who still resided in Mecca, without any powerful family connections that might protect them. Muhammad was moved and forgave Hatib. That does not mean he tolerated disobedience amongst those entrusted with major tasks. He is known to have dismissed appointees if they strayed without reason from clear instructions. But of course, there's a difference between major tasks and less important tasks. During the march on Mecca, he insisted firmly and repeatedly that he wanted to take the city without bloodshed. When he learned that Sa'd ibn Ubaidah, one of the leaders of the four powerful columns advancing upon Mecca, had publicly stated that this was war, so there would be no quarter given, Muhammad immediately relieved him of command. Muhammad was also intolerant of anything less than scrupulous moral conduct, and as Khalid bin Walid's case above shows, he made it publicly clear when he was upset at someone's misconduct. During the Battle of Khyber, He was especially bothered to find hidden in a saddlecloth of one warrior more than the man was entitled to as spoils. He did not punish him physically, but he treated him harshly and publicized his guilt. He was especially intolerant of immoral behavior in anyone in a position of responsibility. He said, "Whoever from among you is appointed by us to a position of authority, and he conceals from us even a needle or something smaller, it will be misappropriation, and he will have to give account to it on the day of judgment." So you see, the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, basically in modern terms, he had a very strong line against corruption. If you're in a position of authority, you're in a position of responsibility. You are a servant to the people who you are looking after. So you're not in that position to despoil them of their wealth that you're not entitled to. But he didn't just say it in a worldly sense, that corruption is bad or there's legal consequences, but they will have to give account on the day of judgment, which for people who had belief in God is quite a strong thing. At one point, he appointed a man called Ibn al-Utbiyah to collect the charity required of the Banu Sulaim. When he arrived back in Medina, he announced to the Prophet all the wealth he gathered, and then presented him with a gift that he said he had received himself as a gift. Muhammad was furious, both that Ibn al-Utbiyah had taken a personal gift while gathering the charity, and that he had presumed Muhammad would take something for himself. He therefore stood on the minbar, the pulpit in the mosque, and exclaimed, "What is the matter with this collector of sadaqah, of charity? We sent him out, and when he returns, he says, 'This is for you, and it's a present which was given to me.' Whoever takes any of the charity will inevitably bring it with them on the day of resurrection, whether it is a camel which growls, an ox which bellows, or a sheep which bleats." Then, stretching out his arms, he said, "O Allah, haven't I made myself clear? O Allah, haven't I made myself clear?" Muhammad understood that egregious wrongdoing could not go unpunished, and he was especially resolute in publicly punishing anyone who threatened the cohesion of the community. During the Battle of Uhud, for instance, Al-Harith ibn Suwaid al-Samit, a Muslim warrior from the Banu Aus, used the smokescreen of the chaos of combat to kill al-Mujaddi al-Diyad al-Balawi, a Muslim fighter from the Banu Khazraj, as revenge in a blood feud. When Muhammad learned of this despicable act, which represented the worst of the old tribal system that Islam had replaced, as well as a lack of honor in putting personal issues ahead of the common good during the time of crisis, he had the men of Al-Harith's local mosque arranged into lines and then spoke to them about the wrongdoing. Al-Harith pleaded for forgiveness, claiming that Satan had seduced him into the act, and even promising to pay the blood money to undertake 2 months of fasting, to free a slave, and to feed 60 poor people. Muhammad remained unmoved. He was appalled by the crime of a Muslim killing a Muslim, and knew he had to demonstrate clearly that the Islamic community now superseded all tribalism. He ordered Al-Harith's execution, which was duly carried out. There's many things in there which, and please, if you don't have the book, you can watch this recording, rewind, and go through it. many interesting things about the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu there and his style of leadership. He was generally easy and tolerant and forgiving with people. But when people were in senior positions, he would not tolerate corruption from them. He would not tolerate people abusing their positions of power. And especially when it was egregious crimes, things which were just too much, like that guy who killed someone else who was another Muslim because of an old blood feud. He wouldn't tolerate this. It's finished. That's replaced by Islam. And why was it replaced by Islam? Because it was totally unjust. This was what caused Arab society before for everybody to be at each other's throats. For so many feuds, so many people being killed, and a lack of peace within Arab society before the coming of Islam. Islam came to stop that. But in order to ensure that it took root and it held, the Prophet Muhammad had, on occasion like that occasion, to take a strong stance and had the person executed for what he had done. Which may seem shocking in today's way of looking at the law and stuff. But in those times, it was actually very merciful because there was very few people that Muhammad had executed like that. It wasn't something that he routinely did. But on occasion, with something so serious, this man had taken someone else's life who was, they were fighting on the same side in the battle. And he just used that excuse and the smokescreen of war to see if he could kill him and get away with it. That's murder. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ applied such a strict sentence. And so it's to make an example so no one else would do it. But there's a lot of these things. Many people, they shy away from discussing this aspect of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's life. But we need to study it. We need to understand. And if we understand, we'll see there's a context for these things. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was not living in a relatively peaceful modern society which already has the rule of law, which already has systems in place to deal with these sorts of things in what is most of the time quite civilized ways. Basically, that region was lawless before the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ applied his system of Islam and brought people to it and implemented it. So it was a huge improvement on what came beforehand. And it's interesting how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave responsibilities to younger people, encouraged people to be leaders. His style of leadership was a style of leadership that created future leaders, and that's why many leaders came out of that community and went to other places and did great things, whether they were not necessarily just leaders of countries but leaders in all manners of respects. And they went on to do the same with the next generation, like a trainer of trainers program. It's very interesting, and there's a lot to be thought about there. And that's not always what happens in our communities today. A lot of leaders don't culture other people to be leaders, and we need to do that more. I hope you found that beneficial, and I'm going to sign off now. I mean, I wish you all a very good evening if you're in the UK, and hope to see you on Monday for my Sohbet and Sufi meditation. If you're in Birmingham, you're most welcome to join me at the chaplaincy. It's around 5:30. And if not, then I look forward to seeing you whenever I do. And I wish you assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings of God be with you all.